Yeah, we're just gonna get this going. I didn't plan on doing a reaction tonight, but the food theory did come out, so
This is a planet covered with This is a planet covered with people.
all right. I'm going back to this because this was the easiest for me to set up. Because it will actually come a little closer to me. So we need to turn this one light right here off, so that there's no glare on the screen. And just to be safe, before we start, all right, let's do this.
Different people, all kinds of people. For thousands of years, all these little people will join other little people to take over other little people. The little people that conquer the other little people will all use one thing and one thing only: bread.
Bread.
Hello, Internet. Welcome to Food Theory, the show that's laying down a trail of breadcrumbs that leads directly to world domination. Today's food theory has been on my bucket list, my breadbasket list, for a while now. And no, it might not be the most searchable. No, it might not be the trending thing on TikTok, but it's always been trending in one place: my stomach. I'm talking about bread. This episode is an homage to the humble loaf, from baguette to brioche, soda bread to cornbread, sourdough, ciabatta, challah to chapati, or just those unlimited breadsticks over at Olive Garden. I love them all. And while you might think that it's the pillowy texture I like, the science of baking, or some sort of weird dark lore about the Pillsbury Doughboy, oh no, my friends, my feelings for bread go much deeper. I love bread because bread means
22
one thing.
instead of 30.
There's nothing more powerful in this entire world than the mighty loaf. Who run the world? Bread. You look skeptical. I get it. All you carbophobes out there don't think that you can take over the world using just bread. If you doubt the power of this puffy hot dog holder, that only means one thing: that I'm gonna have to spend the next 18 minutes or so convincing you in the most unhinged way possible that bread is the most powerful substance on the planet. To show you this, I'm gonna have to tell you the entire history of the world in bread. By the time we're done, you'll not only have a new favorite food, but you'll know how to use it to conquer the world. Grab a slice for the road, everyone, because this one is gonna be a trip. Now, if we're talking about bread conquering the world, we're gonna need to get a little handle on the world itself. So for all of you who weren't finalists in the geography bee in high school, congratulations on doing literally anything else. We're just gonna catch you up here. This is the world, and this right here, that's me, showing you how to conquer the whole thing with carbs. Your next step will be to forget everything that you learned in 12 years of history class or whatever. The only thing that you really need to understand about history is bread. Bread, like all of us, starts from humble beginnings here in Mesopotamia, where it's 30,000 years ago, and bread isn't bread yet. It's instead just some random seeds of grain. Here we are, little ancient people, freshly emerging from the primordial ooze, wandering around killing things with sticks and trying to figure out which leaves we can eat. Someone has the weird idea to eat some wheat seeds grown in the wild. They smash them up a little, mix them with some water, and drop them into the fire until they're crispy. Voila, bread. It's not much to look at. It is a weird, pulpy little cracker, but we love it. Because let me tell you, it is better than eating bugs and leaves. The record of ruins from this time shows that bread is first found in ceremonial and sacred places, meaning that we thought it was pretty cool, a special awesome little cookie of carbs. And we love these ugly little wheat slabs so much that we're like, hey, what if we stopped wandering around and just waited for more of these wheat seeds to grow? And so that's exactly what we did. When you learn history, you think people just stopped being nomadic and then started to develop agriculture. But really, it was the other way around. We were like, hey, we have breadination happening here. This is the best thing since sliced itself. So we're just gonna sit here until more of it grows. And thus civilization was born because people wanted to eat more toast. From there, the popularity of bread, like any great celebrity, goes from fact to legend. For ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, wheat becomes deeply entwined with mythology. The Sumerians developed Nisaba, the goddess of grain and writing. She's a very big deal. Over time, bread hits the road, carried by the people who are still wandering nomads, all the way over to ancient Egypt, where there are some cool new kids in town called calling themselves the pharaohs. Turns out the Egyptians have a little annual event that's pretty helpful for growing wheat. They all live next to this enormous river, the Nile, which was full of crocodiles and Moseses, and was also very good at doing one thing every year, having a flood. The yearly flooding of the Nile, which is part of the natural water cycle of the region, ends up leaving behind a massive area full of well-watered crops with no hauling of water necessary. No digging fancy irrigation lines that no one's invented yet to grow these crops, at least until bread comes around. Turns out, people are going to do a lot of things to get themselves more bread, so they invent elaborate irrigation channels, canals, dams that'll be used all over the world for thousands of years, all inspired by everyone's love of growing more bread. The Egyptians are also conducting wild scientific experiments to find more ways to eat bread, kind of like the Alton Browns of the desert, experimenting with grinding up the wheat and actually mixing it with other stuff. Up to this point, most people were just kind of toasting up wheat seeds and packing them together with some water, then scalding the whole thing in a fire to make a flat, crackery little slab. But the Egyptians, they get wild with it. They make a paste out of ground up wheat and water, which they then leave out in the sun, inventing the entire process of yeast fermentation. Now, other civilizations have done fermentation before. I mean, we've invented beer at this point. We're not monsters. But this is like a whole new frontier for bread. Like the latest TikTok craze, everyone wanted to get their hands on this bread that actually rises for exactly the same reasons that we follow trends today. The clout. The upper classes can now lord it over the little peons still eating flatbread made out of yucky barley instead of cool, puffy wheat. Bread is such an essential part of life that it becomes completely linked with the Egyptian gods, and all religious practices involve offerings of bread. The god Osiris, who is not only the Egyptian god of death and rebirth, but also agriculture, has illustrations showing wheat literally growing out of his body to symbolize resurrection. During festivals in ancient Egypt, priests bake something known as the divine bread, which is bread in the shape of Osiris, who himself was also bread. We're just gonna go with it. Isis, the sister of Osiris, is the goddess of wheat and barley, and by proxy beer, and is also known as the divine baker. She's supposedly responsible for teaching mankind how to make bread, really shafting the Sumerians who were doing it 20,000 years earlier. Everyone's plagiarizing these days. But not only is bread making mythology happen, it's making everything happen. Want to build a pyramid using slave labor? Gonna have to feed them. Bread's gonna come in handy for that. Want to raise an army? Just tell them to pack some bread and a spear. They're good to go. Want to trade with the nations around you? Here's something that might not have been seen before. It's bread. It turns out the Egyptians could grow bread well, and a lot of it, to feed a lot of people. Admittedly, not everyone needed the whole yeast rising process. The Israelites, for example, are like, you guys are mean. You keep your stupid bread bubbles. We got better things to do. And so they take their matzah and flee Egypt. But the rest of the world is like, put that bread in my face right now. Egypt is incredibly powerful because they have the power of the bread. And this will become the pattern for every other nation who gets and grows a lot of wheat. Just watch, because next, bread does something amazing. It crosses the sea. Well, I mean, the sailors cross the sea.
Yeah.
Bread actually lives rent-free on the boats, just like it does in my mind. And now bread is in Greece. As soon as it hits the shores of Greece, bread is the hot item, which you can see reflected again in a huge number of Greek myths and gods that all revolve around the power of bread. The main one is Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, agriculture, and specifically grains. She gives big girl boss vibes. The Greeks are like,
bread
let's
is the
eat
body
bread with
of Christ
every meal,
in
which sounds like a
religion.
dream, but it's going to mean that they need a lot more bread. So much, in fact, that in 600 BC, they invent the first ever closed oven specifically for making bread. Before, people were just cooking everything over open fire pits, which were much less fuel efficient and left less control over the temperature. Using closed ovens, though, the Greeks could suddenly make oodles of bread with less fuel and more consistency, allowing them to feed even more people than the Egyptians could. Just like the Egyptians and their irrigation systems, the oven is basically just there so the Greeks can get more bread. And you know what? It works. In 168 BC, they developed a baker's guild. And before you know it, the bread they make is on its way to Rome and Persia. As people push to the east to get access to the really crazy stuff, like salt, they spread bread to the areas that we now know as Western Asia. It's here that the new bread-making techniques really take off. Wheat is a key part of the Persian Empire, especially when it comes to flatbread. They spread flatbread throughout the Middle East and Central Asia because it's durable,
history
it's easy
lesson.
to transport, and it's a cinch to make even when you're traveling without any sort of special equipment. All you need is a really flat rock and a fire to heat it up. At this point, the only nations
This really
who
is more of a
are
history
powerful
week
enough
for
to
Matt.
rival each other are the Greeks and the Persians. So of course, the two of them go to war. Ever heard of Aeneas, the Battle of Marathon? Xerxes, who invaded Greece in the year 300? All that happens, and sure, you can learn all the names of the heroes and the battles and all that stuff, but what it really comes down to is bread versus bread, and who has more bread. And the answer is the Romans. Rome, in their classic move of stealing everything from the Greeks, quickly adopts bread as the food source for their new empire, and proceed to beat everyone with their awesome new inventions for making more bread. They injected lots of bread references into their own gods.
At some point, he's
Ceres is the equivalent of Demeter. And while Rome certainly liked the smaller ovens that
At some point, he's going to mention it's
like,
the body
yeah,
of Christ.
What if we did it they made the first bakery-sized ovens to outfit commercial and government bakeries to supply bread to the masses. And with that, here comes bread's latest play for world domination, politics. See, the Romans don't win over 2/3 of Europe and that big chunk of Asia, and like that massive top section of Africa for nothing. They also don't do it by keeping a massive standing army or holding everyone under martial law. That would be impossible. No, the way they do it is with bread. The Roman Empire knows that everyone's really into the stuff, so to keep populations loyal to them, they set up government-sponsored welfare in the form of Kyora Anonai, or a grain dole that provides grain or bread to hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens. You ever hear about all those great roads that Rome built back in the day? They did it to transport bread, or at least the wheat to make the bread, which they imported from Egypt, Sicily, and other places across the empire, and then distributed to all
I'm gonna ditch the TV.
Guess who's not gonna rebel against you? People getting shipments of food from you. Remember, bread is the most efficient
and tasty form of nutrition the world has ever seen. All the cool kids have it, which means that everyone else wants to be a part of the in crowd and get in on those hot bread trade routes. The populations who receive bread from the empire grow from about 40,000 to about 200,000. And guess what? They stay loyal. Rome's play to win over the world with bread is best known by the phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses. A phrase still used to this very day because there are two things in the world that you need to keep the lowly masses placated. You give them bread and you keep them entertained. Why? Because bread wins, and when the bread runs out, so does your empire. Back in old Rome, the systems for doling out bread to the masses become incredibly popular, as you would expect. But in the later years of the Roman Empire, their strategy starts to backfire because people simply stop working and instead wait for the emperor to just give them their bread. There's a massive decline in productivity, Roman innovation, and of course, no one wants to join the army when you can just sit at home and get free stuff all the time. So Rome's footprint begins to shrink when the bread bureaucracy gets bigger than its army. When the edges of the empire start shrinking because, like, no one's standing out there to defend it, the bread imports stop flowing, the bread doles stop doling, and the Roman Empire comes to a standstill to make way for newer, breadier competitors. From here through about the 1400s, things split a little between East and West, depending on which flavor of Christianity you pick. There were only two flavors, which put you either landing in the Byzantine Empire or the Holy Roman Empire, both of which are ruled by powerful people, and by people, I mean powerful bread. For the Byzantine Empire, which is headquartered in Istanbul, way back when it was Constantinople, not Istanbul, thanks we might be giants, bread is the most important thing they have. Yeah, sure, they have olives and spices and whatever else from the Greeks, but to feed 1 million people now living in Constantinople, they needed one thing more than anything else. They need bread. The Guild of Bakers in Constantinople are considered to be a protected group at this time, and no one can interfere with the making of bread in any way because everyone knows that once the bread stops getting made, the city shuts down. The wealthy eat the great fluffy bread, the peasants continue to eat hard yucky bread, and the monks are usually on a fast, so that kind of takes care of itself. Meanwhile, over at the Holy Roman Empire, bread has already been spread to places like Gaul, where people have adopted it immediately because before they were eating porridge. Christianity is the name of the game.
Oh, now I was going to mention Christianity. I will say that there's sort of been, there has sort of, I just want to bring up quickly, if you go watch my other reaction to the other 3 videos, there has sort of been this similarity between all the videos this week where they've all been very history related for one, and 2, they all seem to have this idea of an upper class and a lower class and like division. So forgive me if I wasn't too reactive in the last video. I was coming out of the sickness. I'm actually better today. Let's finish this week off.
Here, but like the Romans, Greeks, and Egyptians before them, bread still figures heavily into religion, which figures heavily into governing everyone. Give us this day our daily bread. Jesus is the bread of life. Jesus multiplying loaves of bread, and Jesus breaking bread with his disciples are all stories and ideas that figure heavily at this time. Faithfulness to God is tied to the idea of getting enough bread, especially since everyone from all corners of Europe are eating about 2 pounds of bread every day, including using it as plates, which they call trenches. Bread is so central to both the Holy Romans and the Byzantines that governments start stepping in to control it using methods like price fixing. They set the price of bread low enough to be affordable, which was another bread invention that continues to this very day. But as soon as you lose the bread, you start losing the power. After a couple centuries of bad plagues throughout Byzantium, the vulnerable empires left open and some neighbors start conquering the lands that produce the grain. And you know the story by this point, it's the beginning of the end. Slowly, the Byzantines become disorganized and fall to the Turks, who, surprise, surprise, control the grain-making areas of Eastern Europe in the Middle East. So you get it, right? We've been through what, 5 empires now? I think you're starting to get the picture that bread is responsible for the history of the world. But you know what? I can hear your skeptical comments. Yeah, MattPat, but that was then. The world has gone gluten-free at this point. We don't fight with polearms anymore. Modern people stopped caring about bread
Not
long ago,
gluten-free.
right? Wrong. Throughout the centuries of Gaul, which became what we now know as France, the biggest uprisings and rebellions all centered around a shortage of bread. The Grand Rebellion in Lyon in 1529, poor grain harvests lead to the working peasants having no bread, so thousands of them break into the city's granaries to take back the grain from the government. 1590, there's a siege in Paris, where normally Parisians are eating 1.5 to 2.5 pounds of bread a day. They become so desperate for bread during the months-long siege, they grind human bones to make bread flour, which ultimately leads to the king surrendering and France changing religions. Fast forward to the 1760s, where totally unregulated grain production leads to extremely high prices on bread, and people start to starve. In 1775, people start rioting for bread. This isn't called the French Revolution at the time, it's called the Flour War, because people are seriously hangry without their baguettes. 1789, you think the storming of the Bastille was all about getting weapons? It was about getting bread. Sure, the mobs had their torches and their pitchforks, but you know what they were looking for? The royal store of grain. They were literally starving. Marie Antoinette is painted as a villain when she hears about the flour shortages and famously says, "Qu'ils mangent de la brioche," which doesn't mean let them eat cake. It actually means let them eat brioche, which is a luxury form of enriched bread, because bread is still considered to be the be-all, end-all of eating. She probably didn't even actually say this, but the power of a statement about bread is the single most famous and inflammatory quote to come out of the entirety of the French Revolution. But maybe it's just France, right? They're a bit nutty for their bread. No, not by a long shot. Time to check in on another famous empire, the British. Sorry, Tom, she's included here as well. The British Empire, famous for taxing early American colonists on tea, actually plagued with another big problem in the years leading up to the American Revolution: bread shortages. Well, not as famous as the Boston Tea Party, in 1775, thousands of poor American colonists protest from Philadelphia to Salem about the shortages of grain and the incredibly high bread prices, most of which are controlled by the British government. In an article by Barbara Clark Smith, she writes, quote, "Thousands were reported clamoring for bread, and crowds escorted a merchant, a butcher, and a speculator accused of raising prices to the city jail. As it happened in Boston 2 years earlier, crowds assumed the power to identify and punish enemies to the patriot cause. Once again, the enemy of the bread is the enemy of the people. And wouldn't you know it, one little revolution later, and things really start taking off for that new country of America. And why is that? Because wheat is produced in almost every state in the entire country. Heck, we have a specific region called the Wheat Belt. We're always singing about our amber waves of grain. I think it's an accident that the US became a global superpower over the last few hundred years. It shouldn't be when you look at how much bread we have. Today we export almost 50 million tons of wheat every year. Let's just say that policies around producing wheat can get pretty heated, so I'm not going to be going into all that, but to give you an indication, the US government has paid out over $48 billion in wheat subsidies since 1995, all to support wheat production in this country because, once again, say it with me, bread is power. Whew, and with that, we are at the present day. Whew, that took a lot out of me. I hope I've convinced you now that the entire history of the world comes down to bread, and all you have to do is follow who has the bread at any given time. But if you've been watching this channel for a while, you should probably be asking yourself one thing. Why bread? Like, why? Why not any other food?
They'll tell us in a moment, but I will say that compared to the other 3 theories I reacted to last night, I am definitely enjoying this one a lot more.
Item in the entire world.
Maybe
Sure,
I'm just
bread's
hungry.
delicious, but so are baked potatoes, and you could grow those pretty easily. So are beans, and no, beans suck. But you can grow them, so why not
Baked beans are
something
okay.
like the legume civilization? That's a question that was on the mind of one particular cultural anthropologist, Dr. James C. Scott of Yale University, who went and wrote an entire book observing that if you wanted to build an early civilization, you needed to have a grain-based economy, because grain was the only way to have an economy in the first place. If you notice something throughout this episode, it's that people used bread to get what they wanted. Sure, they ate the bread, but they also traded bread to get everything else they needed. You see, at the end of the day, bread isn't just the food source of all these civilizations, it's also the currency. Sure, they may have had gold coins or fancy little francs or whatever, but that's all bogus if everyone is starving. Bread is power because bread is literally money that you can eat. And the rulers of all these empires, they know that. Remember, most of these empires relied on giving free bread to people. Grain was the basis of taxation in all these empires because in order to give food to people who don't have it, you need to take it away from the people who do. And why are you taking grain? Well, grain like wheat is special for three big reasons. First, it's transportable. You need it if you're going to have a big empire with a huge transportation network for food. And what makes something easy to transport? Number two, being light and dry. So it's not going to rot and you won't be carrying around a whole bunch of water with it. Immediately, you can start to see from these criteria that crops like potatoes, lotus roots, most other root starches, they're all out. Potatoes are 70 to 80% water by weight. And water, it's heavy. They didn't have dehydrated instant flakes back in the day, which also meant that they weren't able to easily divide up something like a potato. Wheats and grains, they're very divisible. You can weigh them out down to the 10th of an ounce, so you know exactly how much you're getting or how much you're giving away when you're portioning out doles to the peasants. It also grows number 3 above ground, which doesn't seem like it should be that big of a deal, but it's everything to these empires. Remember, the entire idea of a central government only exists if that government's able to collect taxes from the citizens. Again, these taxes aren't money, they're crops. When someone's growing wheat, they can't hide it. You can literally see the wheat growing months before harvest season, so a tax assessor can roll on by and estimate a farmer's yield for the year. Then you come by at the same precise time every year and you take your cut right as everything's getting harvested. Potatoes, root veggies, some beans, they're not visible. They're grown underground or very close to the soil. That means that farmers can more easily hide them from the government. They can tell the tax collector, oh yeah, we had ourselves a terrible harvest this year. Barely any potatoes, but here's your 10%, I guess. And the tax collector would have no way to know if they were lying. They're a great crop if you're a tax evader, which means that they're terrible if you're a government that's trying to collect taxes. A terrible example of governments only being interested in wheat happened during the Irish potato famine of the 1840s. During this time, it's well known that the Irish were super reliant on potatoes as one of their only food sources. And there are lots of reasons for that, but any idea why they didn't have any wheat around during this period? Well, they did, but a large portion of it was being exported to the British for compulsory payments to the government, who owned Ireland at the time. So, because wheat was easy to transport, the British were more than happy to take it all, while the hundreds of thousands of Irish people died because of the failure of their less taxable potato crop. So, there it is, we're done. Wheat runs the whole world. What? I didn't talk about the whole world? I forgot about all those other continents like South America, the entire eastern part of Asia, most of the continent of Africa, all of Australia. Yeah, you're right. I didn't actually forget about them, but I did focus on the areas of history that this audience is probably most familiar with. But that's not nearly the end of the story, so here's how the mighty bread plays out in the rest of the world. The secret, friends, is this. Having wheat in your country isn't about being smarter than other countries around you. It's not about having better weapons or more technology or whatever. It's all luck. The reason Central and Southern Africa didn't figure heavily into the bread wars over the last few thousand years is that these areas weren't well suited for growing grains. Wheat, as it turns out, is a little bit picky about where it grows, and it needs temperate climates and loamy soil. That's great if you're in the Fertile Crescent, but crummy if you're in the Ivory Coast. If you look at the world map of where grains grow on this planet, you'll notice a few conspicuous absences, notably in a huge part of South and Central America, as well as a huge portion of the African continent, northeastern Asia, and in Central Australia, primarily because most of these places, they're too hot. So you can see that these areas won't be able to come into power using bread alone like us cheaters in Europe, North America, and Central Asia. Their stories play out much like our own, only using a different cereal crop, corn. Corn, or maize, if you're not speaking American English, was a staple crop of Mesoamerican civilizations over yonder in Central and South America. As we've said repeatedly throughout this episode, the history of civilization is really the history of grains. Again, offering those 3 advantages that you associate with the grain. It's easily transportable, it's easily measurable, and it's clearly visible to keep farmers from evading their taxes. And much like the Greeks and Romans infused wheat into their mythology, Mesoamerican mythology swaps all of that out with corn. The Aztecs had Centeotl, the maize god, who we see surrounded by corn, while the Mayans take the idea of grain, and specifically maize, and turn it into the building block of human civilization, literally, where the Mayan creation myth begins with humanity literally being sculpted from dry corn. And, just like other civilizations, they had other options to choose from like potatoes, but freeze-drying these to make them transportable took an incredibly long time, whereas corn, it could be dried right on the stalk. After the decline of the Mayans and Aztecs, largely because of changes to the climate that kept them from producing enough corn, you see the Incas further south in Peru spreading their influence, knowledge, and culture through, say it with me now, bread. Only this time it was bread made from corn. The Incas were master agricultural engineers, and rather than just outright conquering neighboring people groups, they just showed up and said, hey, how about we help you grow better corn? And everyone's like, yeah, I'll take that. And the Incan Empire thrives until the Europeans show up and ruin everything like they tend to, bringing it all back together into one unified timeline. On the other end of the world, stay with me here, this is gonna get tricky. The same thing happens again. Zooming in on the other side of the ocean and looking at that grain map again, you get a big old pocket in this middle area of China that's a good place to grow grain, which is why grain appears right there on the national emblem of China. Except this time we're not talking about wheat or corn, we're talking rice. Well, the ancient Egyptians were becoming an early major civilization through the power of wheat. Asia had a growing empire of its own in what we now know as modern-day China. And just like civilizations took off in ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt because the conditions were just right for growing grains, we can see a similar pattern throughout Asian history. If you wanted to support a government that could collect taxes and efficiently distribute food as a resource, you needed to have conditions that were right for grains. Enter the balmy, humid Yangtze River Valley, perfect for rice cultivation and the cradle of Chinese civilization, in much the same way that the Fertile Crescent was for Mesopotamia. You may have heard about the Three Kingdoms period in ancient Chinese history, where three rival states existed, the Shu, the Wu, and the Wei. It probably comes as no surprise that for each of these three kingdoms, you can trace the source of their power to some ideal condition that allowed them to cultivate rice. Shu had the Sichuan Basin, Wei had the Yellow River Valley, and Wu had the lower Yangtze River. In the same way that grain was a source of government power in the Western world, rice and the conditions for growing it represented power in the Eastern world. And while sure, rice isn't always made into bread, it is made into buns and noodles and all kinds of bread-adjacent products. It also functions in the same way as bread, and most importantly of all, drives the same power dynamic that fuels everything in history. So there you have it, friends. The history of the world is all just bread. In the future, is it possible that the history of the world will still rely on something as simple as bread, even in the face of all the weapons and technology and AI and Amazon? Yeah, I think it will. Follow the bread, and you'll always see who's in the power seat. Now, if you'll excuse me, after making it through the last few tens of thousands of years of history, I want a little slice of toast. And as always, my friends, remember, it's just a theory. A food theory. Bon appetit. And hey, if you're interested in more food history, check out how coffee single-handedly caused human enlightenment. No joke, the science that we have available to us today is solely thanks to the humble coffee bean. That video is on screen right now, so make sure you click it. And as always, my friends, I'll see you next week.
Okay, so, food theory, bread. Bread runs the world. I mean, bread is important. I knew at some point he was going to have to. History of the entire world according to bread. So it is more of a history video. Again, he does those for like his game theories. They're a little trickier to react to. Like, I think I did a better reaction, even though I was sick last night, to the style theory. Try to speak a little bit. I can give my thoughts more on this one. You know, as a Christian, I know the whole importance of bread, the bread of life. And I won't go too into detail about it, but if you're a Christian, you know that bread turns into God's body, or Jesus' body, during communion. Let's see. Corn, you know, I knew it could be made other ways. I'm in the, I don't know whether corn's a vegetable or a grain, or because it's technically fruit. Fruit because the little kernels are seeds, they say. And then on the other hand, it grows above ground, so it meets like the requirements for grain because it can be made into, I mean, it can be made into bread. Cornflakes, perfect example. Cornbread, is that made from actual dried up corn? I think so. Cornmeal, corn, a lot of stuff. So corn, he did actually bring up corn, which was honestly another thing I didn't think of. And then he said China. He actually brought up rice, which is another popular grain. So it would make sense for rice. I mean, I'm an anime watcher, so Japanese, but that's still right there in Asia. So I would argue that I don't know how much it ran the world, but I know that it's pretty darn important. Let's just say it shows up in a lot of anime, a lot of Japanese anime. I mean, you can even look at Naruto, Ichiraku ramen. What is ramen? It is his ramen always has rice in it. No, ramen's a soup. Does it have rice in it though? No, but they do have like the ramen bowls there or something, like rice balls. That's what I was thinking. And I myself have actually had sushi before. I like sushi, and what is that? That's fish and that's raw fish and white rice. Uh, that's Japanese, of course. So they love their heck. Even we love here rice. I would actually take rice over mashed potatoes, believe it or not. White rice over mashed potato. Just throw some, or like my dad makes this great, uh, like multi-grain rice, and he'll throw raisins in it, and I swear it's awesome. Can't make it right here at the rental, but we don't have much at the rental. We're about a third of the way done, though. Almost time to go home. I think that MattPat will be done with his theories by the time that I leave the rental because there's only 7 left now. I am gonna get some sort of camera at some point for the reaction, especially if people keep watching the videos. If I can get up to like 100 views per video, where people are gonna actually watch it, then I'll make like a big announcement that, oh, I'm gonna do a live reaction. I'll put a proper camera up here. I do have one at home, but it is away in storage, and we can't get it into the house right now. So, unfortunately, otherwise I would have brought my bed because I've been having a hard time with this bed. And I won't get into the personal life. Ski videos. I know I didn't do it working this weekend. Like I said, I was sick, but I have been shooting them. Ski videos are coming up. And of course, more reactions. It'll be a few days now before MattPat puts out the next set of theories. 6 theories left. It says 7 theories left, but was that 7 theories included in this? Or was that 7 theories after this? I think it's included in this because we've done 3 weeks of these reactions. And he said there were 9 theories left. Whatever the case, that's this week's theories now actually complete now that the food theory has been posted. So, see you next week for more reactions. If not, yeah, it's going to be another couple weeks before I get the ski video finished for good and uploaded.